Settle in. Let the room go quiet around you. Wherever you are, whatever the hour, there is a word you already know. You have met it in the news, in arguments, in that small, uneasy feeling that somewhere a record is being kept of you. The word is Orwellian. People reach for it whenever the truth seems to be slipping out of their hands. Behind that word there was a person, a thin, tired, oddly gentle man who spent one short life trying to see things as they truly were, and to say them plainly, even when plainness cost him nearly everything. Tonight you do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to agree or disagree. You only need to breathe a little slower, and let the day loosen its grip, as we follow one honest life from its beginning to its quiet end. His name was Arthur Blair. The world would come to know him as George Orwell. There is no hurry tonight. We have all night. Chapter 1. An Empire's Child. Begin far from where you are now. A small town in the east of India, low and green and very hot, where the air in the middle of the day grows heavy and stops moving, and even the birds fall silent until the worst of the heat has passed. The town is called Motihari. The year is 1903. The British Empire is near the height of its power, spread across so much of the map that people in London like to say, with comfortable pride, that the sun never sets on it. And in one modest house, on the 25th of June, a baby boy is born into the lower edges of that empire's ruling class. His parents name him Eric Arthur Blair. He will not remember this country. He is too young. The heat, the light, the sounds of the town will sink below the reach of memory before he can hold them. But the empire he has been born into will follow him all his life. First as a simple fact, the water he swims in, then as a question, and at the end, as something he feels he must answer for. Rest here a moment, in that quiet house, before the story moves. There is time. The baby's father is a man named Richard Walmsley Blair. He is not wealthy and not powerful. He is a careful, dutiful, rather distant man, who has spent his whole working life as a minor official in the service of the Empire in India. And the particular work he does tells you almost everything about the world this child has entered. Richard Blair worked in the opium department. Let that land, because it sounds strange to a modern ear. For many years the British government in India ran the opium trade as a business of the state. It oversaw the growing of the poppy, the processing of the drug, and its sale, much of it bound for China, where the trade caused enormous and well-documented harm. Eric's father was one of the many small, ordinary men who kept the paperwork of that business in order. He inspected the crop. He checked the quality. He filed his reports, year after year, drew his modest salary, and thought of himself, as far as anyone can tell, as nothing more than a respectable servant of the crown. That is the part to hold on to. The empire did not run on monsters. It ran on polite, dutiful men doing polite, dutiful jobs, most of whom never paused to ask what the whole machine was for, or who paid for it far away. The son born in that house would spend much of his life asking exactly that question, and refusing the comfort of not knowing. Now the mother, her name is Ida Mabel Blair. She is younger than her husband, Livelier, more restless, more drawn to books and music and talk. Her family, the Limousins, were of French descent, and they had built and lost their fortunes far to the east, in Burma, in teak and trade. Ida had grown up partly in that warmer, more colourful world, on the far side of the Bay of Bengal. So the child carries two inheritances from the first day. On his father's side, the grey machinery of imperial administration. On his mother's side, a more adventurous line that had chased money through the tropics and felt it rise and fall. He is, from birth, a small meeting point of the empire's many threads. There is an older sister in the house too, a girl named Marjorie, born about 5 years before him. Later there will be a younger sister, Avril. For now, picture the three of them, mother and daughter and infant son, in a country the empire insists belongs to England. Though it belongs to none of them, the scene is about to change, and the warmth is about to fall away. When Eric is still a baby, only about a year old, his mother does what countless British families in India did. She takes the children home to England. Home, for these families, always meant England, even for children who had never seen it. The father stays behind in the heat, with his ledgers and his poppy fields, to keep earning, to keep the small household afloat from thousands of miles away. So Richard Blair remains in India, and Ida sails west with the children, toward a grey, cool, rainy country. Her small son will now grow up calling home, though he arrives there almost a stranger. The father will be largely absent for years. He will visit, he will write, but Eric will grow up in a house shaped by his mother and his sisters, in the particular hush of a family keeping up appearances on not quite enough money. That phrase matters. Keeping up appearances. Hold it, because it is one of the small keys to this whole life. The family settles in time in the pleasant riverside town of Henley-on-Thames, and here the strange social truth of Eric's childhood takes shape. They are not poor in the way the working families down the road are poor, but they are not comfortable either. They have the manners, the accent, the expectations of the upper middle class, without the money that is supposed to come with all of it. They live on the appearance of a position they cannot quite afford. Years later, as a grown man, Orwell would describe his own origins with a phrase so precise it is almost a joke. He placed his family in the lower, upper middle class. Sit with that, because it grows both funnier and sadder the longer you look. He is describing a social ladder so finely divided that there is an upper part of the middle, and then a lower part of that upper part, and his family clings to the bottom rung of even that. This was not vanity, it was observation, and it started early. This watchful boy noticed that the England around him was sorted into countless invisible layers, and that everyone knew, without anyone ever saying it aloud, exactly which layer they belonged to, and which sat above and below. He noticed which families truly had servants, and which only strained to look as though they did. He noticed how people spoke, how they dressed, what small things they were ashamed of. A child who has plenty rarely studies these things. A child who has nothing may be too busy surviving to study them. But a child taught to feel almost grand, while sensing all the while that the money underneath is thin, becomes a natural watcher. He learns to read a room, He learns where the seams are, and where the careful surface hides something underneath. That is the boy in the riverside house, bookish, often unwell, a little solitary, with a quick and distant mind, and an early habit of noticing the things polite people agree not to mention. He is not yet a writer. He is not yet George Orwell. He is Eric Blair, a small English boy with an unremembered India behind him, an absent father filing reports on the far side of the world, and a sharp talent for seeing the truth of where he stands. Let that picture settle as the chapter closes. An empire at the height of its confidence, and at the edge of it, almost too small to notice. A watchful child who would one day take that whole comfortable world and set it down in words, and never quite let it rest easy again. For now, let him be a boy beside a river, in the grey light of England, with the whole long life still ahead, and no need to hurry toward any of it. Let him stay there a while, and rest. Chapter 2. The Scholarship Boy. The boy grows, and the gentle riverside light gives way to something colder. He is about 8 years old now. The softness of early childhood is ending. For a family like the Blairs, careful and proud and short of money, one road mattered above all others. Education, the right school, the accent polished a shade brighter, and above all a scholarship, if the boy proved clever enough, to carry him toward the life his parents quietly believed should have been theirs. And Eric was clever enough. Everyone could see it. So, in the autumn of 1911, he is sent away, not to the school down the lane, but to a boarding school on the south coast, in the seaside town of Eastbourne, where the cold grey waves come in off the channel. The school is called St. Cyprian's. It was a preparatory school, and its single purpose was to prepare the sons of the comfortable classes to win places at the great public schools. The famous institutions like Eton and Harrow that fed the English ruling class generation after generation. Picture the size of that change for a small boy. One week he is at home beside the river, near his mother and sisters, in rooms he knows. The next he is in a cold dormitory among strangers, far from anyone who loves him, woken by a bell, expected to perform, expected to be grateful. Let that loneliness sit a moment, because it shaped him more than almost anything else in these years. Here we step carefully, the way Orwell himself always tried to. Much of what we know about his time at St. Cyprian's comes from an essay he wrote near the end of his life, called Such. Such were the joys. It is a furious, brilliant, wounded piece of writing. In it he describes the school as a place ruled by snobbery and fear, where the wealthy boys were flattered and the poorer scholarship boys, like himself, were reminded again and again, often cruelly, that they were there on charity and had better be thankful. It is a powerful account and a convincing one, but it is one man's memory, written decades later, in illness and pain. Other former pupils remembered the same school differently, and some remembered it fondly. So the honest thing to say is this: whether or not St. Cyprian's was as harsh in fact as Orwell remembered it in feeling, what matters for our story is what the young Eric came to believe about it, and what it taught him to feel in his body about power and shame. And what it taught him was a single hard lesson, that the world was divided, that the divisions were held in place through fear and humiliation, that a boy could be made to feel small, not for anything he had done, but simply for what his family did or did not have. He was learning the thing the rest of his life would circle back to. He was learning what power feels like from underneath, not from the comfortable seat of the one who holds it, but from below, where it presses down and tells you the pressing is your own fault. There is one telling thread from these years that you need only in shape, not in detail. Orwell later wrote about being a sensitive child made to feel wicked and shameful for things outside his control. You do not need the particulars. You need only the lesson the boy drew. The people in charge could decide what counted as good and what counted as bad, what was normal and what was shameful, and the child had almost no power to argue back. A boy who learns that lesson early can go one of two ways. He can spend his life accepting it, fitting himself to it, learning to press down on others in turn, or he can spend his life refusing it. Eric Blair would spend his life refusing it. But here is the thing that makes him interesting, rather than merely bitter. He refused the lesson while winning at the game built around it. For all his unhappiness, he did exactly what the school existed to make him do. He worked. He studied. He won. In 1916 he sat the examinations that would shape his future, and he won scholarships to two of the most prestigious schools in the country, Wellington and then Eton. After a short time at Wellington, a place opened at Eton, and early in 1917 that is where he went, as what the school called a King's Scholar, one of the small number admitted on merit rather than money. Understand what that meant. Eton was, and still is, the school of princes and prime ministers, the heart of the English establishment, and Eric Blair, the boy from the family with the thin purse and the careful manners, walked in through its ancient gates, not as a paying gentleman, but as a scholarship boy. On the strength of his own mind, he has climbed a long way, this watchful, lonely child, and yet, even here, the strange double vision continued. He was inside the establishment now, among the sons of the genuinely powerful, wearing the same old uniform, reading the same old books. There is a pleasing footnote from these years, which we hold lightly rather than make too much of. For a time, one of the men who taught French at Eton was a young writer named Aldous Huxley, who would go on to imagine a famous and unsettling future world of his own. We do not know how much the two truly crossed paths, but it is a quiet pleasure to picture them. Two future authors of dark and dazzling imagined worlds, briefly under one roof, neither yet knowing what he would become. By the accounts of those who knew him at Eton, Eric was not a straining, prize-hungry pupil. Having fought his way in by sheer effort, he relaxed once through the gate. He read widely and on his own terms. He was clever, dry, a little detached, more interested in his own thoughts than in the rewards the school dangled in front of its boys. He was settling into the shape of an observer rather than a competitor, a watcher rather than a climber, and at the end of it, around 1921, he came to the choice every Eton boy of his kind was expected to make almost without thinking. The natural next step, the smooth and obvious one, was university, Oxford or Cambridge, the well-worn path into the comfortable professions and the settled life. He did not take it. This is one of the first true turning points of the life. So let it land clearly. The boy who had climbed so hard, who had won the scholarships, who had reached the very top of the English school system through his own effort, chose not to take the final, expected step up into the English elite. Why he chose as he did, we can only partly know. Part of it was money. A further scholarship was far from certain, and the family purse was as thin as ever. And part of it was that watchful, contrary spirit that had been growing in him since the cold dormitory by the sea. Some stubborn part of him did not want the comfortable life Eton was holding open. Some part of him wanted out, wanted away, wanted to see, with his own eyes, the wider world the boys of Eton were being groomed to govern without ever truly looking at it. So he made a decision that astonished the people around him. Instead of Oxford, instead of a soft path into a profession, he chose to go to the very edge of the empire and serve it directly. He applied to join the imperial police and asked to be sent east. He asked to be sent to Burma. Let that choice rest as the chapter ends. A young man, fresh out of the most privileged school in England, turning his back on the easy future and walking toward the heat and the hardness and the moral weight of the empire his father had served and his mother's family had once lived inside. He did not yet know what he would find there. He knew only that he wanted to see it for himself rather than take it on trust, and what he found would change him for the rest of his days. For now, let him pack his trunk in the lamplight, with no need to rush. The ship will wait. Rest a while. Chapter 3. Burma. The cool grey of England falls away behind him, and the heat returns, thick and damp and full of unfamiliar sound. It is the autumn of 1922. Arthur Blair, 19 years old, has crossed half the world by sea. He has sailed out through the Mediterranean, down through the Suez Canal, across the wide Indian Ocean, and at last into the humid air of Burma, the eastern reach of British India, the very land where his mother's family had once made and lost their fortune. He has come to be a policeman. Picture him as he arrives, tall, already strikingly tall, thin, awkward, formal, a young Englishman in a uniform that never quite fits the bookish person inside it. He has joined the Imperial Police, and over the next several years he will be posted to a series of towns across Burma, given real authority over real people, made responsible for order, for the law, for the daily turning of the machinery of imperial control. Here is the heart of it. The watchful boy who had felt power pressing down on him from above, at school and in the careful poverty of home, is now the one holding the power. He is barely out of his teens, and he is an agent of the empire. He carries its authority on his body. He enforces its rules. He represents, in his single thin frame, the claimed right of a small cold island far away to govern millions of people who never asked to be governed by it. For about 5 years, this is his life. We see these years more clearly than almost any other part of his youth, because Burma is where Arthur Blair began to turn into George Orwell. Long after he left, he returned to this time in his writing. Most famously, in 2 short pieces students still read all over the world. One is called A Hanging. The other is called Shooting an Elephant. We hold them the way he would want us to, with care. They are works of literature, shaped and chosen and arranged, not police reports, but they carry the unmistakable weight of a man trying to describe what it felt like to stand on the wrong side of his own conscience. Day after ordinary day. In A Hanging, he describes being present at an execution. The piece is quiet, and all the more terrible for it. Its power gathers around a single moment, when the condemned man, walking under guard toward his death, steps lightly to one side to avoid a puddle on the ground, and the narrator understands all at once, with a force that never quite leaves him, that this is a living man, with a working mind and a body that still protects itself from a little water, and that in a few moments all of it, the whole world inside this one person, will be deliberately destroyed by the machinery the narrator himself serves. Let that image stay with you for a breath. A man stepping around a puddle on his way to be hanged. It is exactly the small human detail the Empire would prefer no one noticed. What set Orwell apart, even this early, was that he could not stop himself from noticing and would not let himself look away. In Shooting an Elephant, he describes being called out to deal with an elephant gone loose and dangerous in a town. By the time he reaches it, the animal has calmed and stands peacefully in a field. He does not want to kill it. There is no longer any need. But a large crowd of local people has gathered behind him, watching, waiting, expecting the English officer to act, to perform the role of the man in charge, and he feels the sick pressure of their eyes. He is supposedly the master here, yet he understands, in that moment, that he is trapped, an actor obliged to play a part for the crowd, that he will do what the Empire expects rather than what he believes is right, because to hesitate now would be to look weak in front of the very people he is meant to rule. So he shoots the elephant, slowly and clumsily, against his own clear wish, simply to avoid looking like a fool. Out of that, as he came to understand it, he reached one of the central insights of his life. Empire does not only harm the people it rules, it deforms the people who rule. It traps them in a role they must keep performing. It makes them hard, makes them cruel, not always out of hatred, but to keep up the endless performance of being in command. This is the lesson Burma carved into him, year by year, and we have to be honest, the way he forced himself to be honest about it later. Eric Blair was not a secret saint during these years, objecting in his heart to everything while his hands stayed clean. By his own later account, he did the job. He gave the orders. He was part of a system that beat and jailed and humiliated people, and he carried out his share of it. He carried, for the rest of his life, a heavy and personal guilt about this, a feeling that he had been, as he put it, part of an oppression he had come to hate. The honesty lives in that guilt. He never let himself off lightly. He never pretended he had merely watched from a clean and blameless distance. And post by post, season by season, the work became unbearable, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the daily accumulation, the faces in the prison, the easy contempt some of his fellow officers showed the Burmese, and above all the growing certainty, settling deeper into his chest each month, that the whole vast respectable structure of the Empire was, when you look straight at it, a tyranny dressed up in good manners. He had gone to Burma to see the Empire for himself rather than take it on trust. Now he had seen it, and he could not, in good conscience, Keep serving it. In 1927, he came home to England on leave, worn thin and unwell, his lungs already beginning to trouble him in the way they would for the rest of his life. And during that leave, back in the familiar grey damp of the English coast, he made the second great decision of his life, as firmly as he had made the first. He resigned. He gave up the secure salary, the pension waiting at the end, the respectable career, and the whole solid future the empire had been holding out to him. He was in his mid-20s, with almost no money of his own, no clear profession to step into, and a family who could not understand why a sensible young man would throw away such a good and stable position. But he was certain in a way that left no room for argument. He would not go back. He would not be a servant of the empire for one more day than he had to be. Let that decision rest as the chapter closes. A young man giving up safety, on purpose, with his eyes open, for the sake of a conscience he could no longer talk himself out of. He did not yet know what he would do instead, or how he would live, or who he would become. He knew only what he could no longer bring himself to do. He had stopped being a servant of power. Now, through failure at first, and mostly in private, he would begin the long work of learning to write against it. For now, let him come home through the rain. Let him fold the uniform away for the last time and set it down. The decision is made, and the night is long. Chapter 4. Down and Out. He is home again in England, in the thin grey light of 1927, and a simple question rise. What does a young man do who has just given up a good career and has no plan for another? Most people in that position would look, reasonably, for safety. Arthur Blair did something stranger, and far more deliberate, and it is one of the real keys to the whole life that followed. He did not look for safety. He went looking, on purpose, for the very bottom. He had spent 5 years in Burma, helping to hold up a structure that pressed down on people with no power to push back. He had come home carrying a private weight of guilt, and out of that guilt grew a strange and powerful need. He wanted, for a while, to live on the underside of life. He wanted to know, not from books or from a comfortable distance, but in his own body and his own hunger, what it actually felt like to be poor, to be cold, to be looked through as though he were not there, to be treated by the respectable world as nothing. So he began, deliberately, to go down into the world of the very poor. Let that land, because it was a genuinely unusual thing to do. He was an Eton-educated young Englishman. He could have dined in warm rooms and written clever, sympathetic things about poverty from a tidy distance, the way a good many writers did. Instead, he put on worn-out clothes and went into the poorest districts of London, and lived among the homeless and the destitute, in cheap lodging-houses and on the road, a tramp among tramps. He slept in the grim common shelters the very poor used when they had nowhere else. He stood in the bread lines. He learned the unwritten rules of that hidden England, where a man without money might sleep, how to find a meal, how the law treated a person with no fixed address and nothing in his pockets. And through all of it he listened, with the patient attention he had carried since he was a lonely boy by the sea. Feel how far he has travelled, from the gentle riverside house, to the cold grandeur of Eton, to ruling a district in Burma. and now to a hard bench in a London shelter among the forgotten. By his own choice. Then, around the spring of 1928, he crossed the sea to Paris. He took a cheap room in a poor working district on the left bank of the river, on a narrow street called the Rue du Pot de Fer. Paris, in those years, was famously full of artists and writers and dreamers. But Eric Blair did not live among them. He lived among the laundresses and the labourers and the small struggling shopkeepers, and tried to make his way as a writer, sending out articles and stories, most of which came back rejected, and then his money ran out. This is where the experience that would become his first book truly began. With his savings gone and nothing coming in, he had to find work simply to eat, and the work he found was at the very bottom of the great Paris hotels and restaurants. He became what the French called a plongeur, a dishwasher, one of the unseen men who labour in the steaming heat of the hotel basements, hour after hour, often 15 or 16 or 17 in a single day, washing the dishes and scrubbing the pots that keep the elegant dining rooms above them running. Feel the heat of that kitchen for a moment, the way he wanted his readers to feel it. The noise, the clatter and the shouting, the stacks of dirty plates that never grow smaller, the exhaustion that sinks past the muscles into the bone, and above, up a flight of stairs and through a door. Wealthy diners in clean linen eat beautiful food and never once think of the man below them, whose entire day is the grease and the steam and the scalding water. Eric Blair was that man, and he never forgot what it felt like to be invisible. We should be honest here, exactly as he tried to be. The book that grew out of all this is a shaped thing. It is literature, not a diary. Scholars have long pointed out that he most likely rearranged events, sharpened scenes, and combined several real people into single characters, to make the truth of it land harder. He himself was open that it was not a strict, minute-by-minute record, so we read it as he meant it to be read, as a true picture painted by an artist who had lived inside it, rather than a sworn account of each passing hour. But the truth at the centre is solid. He really did go hungry. He really did wash those dishes in those basements until he could barely stand. He really did sleep in those shelters among the destitute. He went and found the underside of the modern world with his own 2 hands, and wrote it down plainly, so the comfortable people living above it could not so easily pretend it was not there. When he came back to England, he kept living this double life for a while, a struggling writer who would still go out on the road as a tramp from time to time, to gather material, to keep himself close to the reality he wanted to describe truthfully, and out of all those filled notebooks and hard memories, he built his first real book. He told the story in 2 halves, the Paris kitchens and the London streets, the 2 cities of his chosen poverty, and he gave it a plain, honest, unglamorous title that said exactly what it was about. Down and out in Paris and London. And now we come to a small moment that changes everything that follows, though almost nothing visible happens in it. The book was accepted for publication by a publisher named Victor Gollancz. It was to appear at the start of 1933, but one decision remained. The author did not want to publish under his own name. He was uneasy about it. Part of him worried about embarrassing his family, who might not enjoy seeing the Blair name attached to a book about tramps and dishwashers. And part of him simply wanted a clean line drawn between the man and the work, a fresh self to match the new life. So he offered his publisher a short handful of possible names, and among them was the one he leaned toward. For the first name he chose George, a plain, solid, thoroughly ordinary English name, and for the surname he reached for a river he knew and loved in the county of Suffolk, the River Orwell, George Orwell. From this point on, that is the name the world will use. Eric Blair, the man, went on living and eating and coughing and loving and struggling, under his own real name, to his friends and family, to the end of his days. But the writer, the voice, the conscience that would one day speak to millions of strangers it never met, that figure was born here, almost without ceremony, and his name was George Orwell. It is worth pausing on how plainly it happened. No grand announcement, no ringing manifesto, just a poor, unwell, stubbornly determined young man, choosing a homely first name and the name of a river he loved. Near the bottom of a letter to his publisher, the bullet chewed modestly well. It found readers. It marked him, quietly, as a writer worth watching, and more than that, it set the pattern the rest of his life would follow. He would not write about the world from a safe and distant chair. He would go and live it, and suffer some real part of it in his own body, and only then write it down, in language as clear and clean and free of decoration as he could make it. He was 30 years old. He had been a colonial policeman, a tramp, and a dishwasher, and now, at last, under a borrowed name drawn from an English river, he was a writer. Let him rest there tonight. The man and the new name walking on together into the larger work ahead. The river runs on, and there is time enough. Chapter 5. The Road to Wigan Pier. A few years pass, and we find him at work, head down, building the thing he was made for. Through the early 1930s, George Orwell did what writers do. He wrote. He published a novel drawn out of his Burma years, called Burmese Days, a hard and honest book about the loneliness and quiet corruption of colonial life. He wrote other novels too, turning his attention to the lives of ordinary, unglamorous, struggling people, a poor clergyman's daughter, a shabby bookshop assistant choking on his hatred of money and his need for it. He was not yet famous. He earned very little, but he was building, book by book, a body of work and, more importantly, a way of seeing the world and setting it down. And he was sharpening the one thing that would come to define him, a plain, exact, unsparing honesty about how life truly was for the people with no power over their own circumstances. Then, early in 1936, came a journey that pushed him further to the political left than he had ever been, and handed him one of his most important books. His publisher, Victor Gollancz, who was deeply involved in left-wing politics, wanted a book about the real condition of the working class in the industrial north of England. The country was still caught in the long economic depression. In the great mill towns and mining towns of the north, unemployment was savage, poverty was everywhere and grinding, and millions were living lives of hardship the comfortable south of England preferred not to think about. Orwell was the right man to send, and he knew it. He had already proven, in the Paris kitchens and the London shelters, that he would never be content to observe from a clean distance. So he went north, into Lancashire and Yorkshire, to towns like Wigan and Barnsley and Sheffield, and once again he did the thing he always did. He went, and he lived inside it. He stayed in the cheap lodging houses of the poor. At one low point he lodged above a tripe shop, a dismal place he later described with unsparing disgust, the kind of place where the bad food and the close smells and the general air of hopelessness all ran together. He sat in the cramped front rooms of unemployed families and listened as they described how they survived on almost nothing. He filled his notebooks with detail, with hard numbers, with the exact price of a loaf of bread and the exact dimensions of the mean little rooms, because he understood that real poverty does not live in grand statements. It lives in the small, exact, grinding details. And then he did the thing from this journey that no reader ever forgets. He went down into a coal mine. Stay with him underground a moment, in the dark and the heat, because he wanted his readers down there with him. He described the brutal, almost unimaginable labour of the miners, and not only the digging at the coal face, but the long journey just to reach it, the crawling and stooping for what could be miles through low, hot, dust-choked passages, before the real work of the shift even began. He, Dal, soft-handed writer, was exhausted merely by the walk to the face. The miners did that same crushing walk, then a full shift of punishing labour, then the long walk back, every working day of their lives, and thought nothing of it. He came up out of that mine carrying a truth he never set down. He wrote, in effect, that all of us who sit in relative comfort, reading our books and holding our opinions and enjoying our warmth, are, in a real sense, standing on the bent backs of men labouring in the dark beneath us. Our ease is built on their pain, and most of us pass our whole lives without once seeing them. This is the engine that drives the book. The result was published in 1937, under the title The Road to Wigan Pier, and it is a strange, two-sided book, which is part of why it matters so much for understanding the man who wrote it. The first half is the reporting, the mines, the lodging houses, the unemployed families, the hard arithmetic of working-class survival. It is some of the most powerful documentary writing in the English language, plain and furious and humane all at once. But the second half is something different, and there Orwell shows the quality that would set him apart for the rest of his life. Instead of delivering the comfortable left-wing argument his publisher had surely hoped for, he turned and looked hard at his own side. He declared himself, clearly and without apology, a believer in socialism, in a fairer world where the poverty he had just described would no longer be tolerated. But in the same book he criticised many socialists themselves, sharply, sometimes rudely, complaining about the cranks and the snobs and the comfortable theorists he felt were driving ordinary working people away from a cause that should have been their own. This was deeply awkward for everyone. His publisher, who had commissioned the book for a left-wing readership, was so unsettled by the second half that he added a nervous introduction of his own, warning readers that the author spoke only for himself, and that, in its way, is almost the perfect emblem of the man. He spoke only for himself. He would commit himself fully, body and conscience, to the cause of the poor and the powerless, but he would never switch off his own honesty, not even to please his own allies, not even when it would have been far easier to do so. He criticised the political right because, as he saw it, the right defended injustice openly, and he criticised the political left because, as he saw it, the left so often failed to be honest with itself about its own failures. He belonged firmly to a side, and refused to flatter it. This is the man, now nearly complete in his deepest instinct, a socialist who would always annoy the socialists, a patriot who would often enrage the patriots, a writer whose first loyalty was not to any party or flag, but to seeing clearly and saying plainly what he saw. There is one more thing to set into this stretch of the story, because the private life was changing too. In the summer of 1936, around the time of all this work, he married. Her name was Eileen O'Shaughnessy. She was intelligent, witty, well educated, a woman who had set aside her own studies to share his difficult, uncertain, often physically uncomfortable life. For a time they settled in a small cottage in the village of Wallington, where he kept a tiny village shop, tended a garden and a few animals, and lived close to the bone, as he almost always chose to. We will walk further with Eileen before long, because her part in this story is real and important and, in the end, quietly heartbreaking. For now, simply know that as this chapter closes, he is no longer alone. There is a partner beside him, sharing the cold cottage and the thin money and the work, and it is just as well, because the road was about to turn sharply and lead him somewhere genuinely dangerous. For at the very end of that same year, 1936, far to the south, in the harsh sunlight and the gathering violence of Spain, a war had broken out, and George Orwell, who could never bring himself to watch an injustice from the safety of a chair, had already decided he was going to go. Let him close the door of the little cottage behind him as the chapter ends. The journey south can wait until tomorrow. Rest now. Chapter 6. Spain. The settled quiet of the English cottage fades, and we travel south with him into what would become the most decisive year of his life. There is no need to brace yourself. We will walk through even the hardest of it at the pace of someone who means to sleep. It is the very end of 1936. In Spain, a war has broken out that is tearing the country in two and drawing in idealists from all over the world. On one side stand the forces of the elected government, a broad coalition of the left, known as the Republic. On the other stand the rebel generals, led by Francisco Franco, supported by the fascist powers of Europe. To a great many people across the world, this looked like the great moral struggle of the age. Democracy and the common people set against the rising tide of fascism, and so thousands of foreigners made their way to Spain to take some part in it. George Orwell was never going to stay home. He travelled to Spain late in that year, officially to write about the war, but he found, almost at once, that he could not simply stand and watch. So he did the thing he always did. He joined in, he took up a rifle and enlisted in a militia, to fight for the Republic against Franco. But which militia he happened to join would shape everything that followed. Through his connections with a small British left-wing party, he ended up serving not with the larger communist-led forces, but with the militia of a group known by its initials, the POUM, a revolutionary workers' party that was independent of, and increasingly distrusted by, the Soviet-backed communists. Hold that single fact in the back of your mind as we go, because it would later place him in real danger, and because it would hand him the central insight of his career. First, let him arrive in Barcelona, because what he found there moved him as deeply as almost anything ever had. When Orwell reached Barcelona, the city was in the grip of a genuine social revolution. The workers had risen. Grand hotels and shops had been collectivized, run by committees of ordinary people. Waiters looked you in the eye as equals. The old, respectful forms of address that marked rank and class had been dropped. Everyone, it seemed, was calling everyone else comrade. To a man who had spent his whole life watching the cruel and silent machinery of class, who had felt power press down on him from above since he was a small boy in a cold dormitory, this was overwhelming. For the first time in his life, he later wrote, he was breathing the air of equality. He had walked, without quite expecting to, into a living example of the thing he had until then only argued for in books. Feel what that must have meant to him. The watchful outsider, the man who had washed dishes in basements and crawled through coal mines, was suddenly standing in a great city that seemed to be trying, however roughly, to build the fairer world he had come to believe in. He fell in love with it, and he decided, simply and completely, that it was worth fighting for. And then, one morning in May of 1937, near the town of Huesca, the war reached him directly and very nearly ended him. He was standing in a trench at dawn, talking, when a sniper's bullet struck him in the throat. It passed clean through his neck. By every ordinary expectation, a wound in that place should have killed him. The men around him believed, in the first moments, that he was finished, and he himself, lying in the dirt of the trench, was certain he was dying, and he later described, with that strange clarity of his, the oddly calm feeling of believing, in that moment, that his life was simply over. Breathe slowly here, in the hush that comes after the shot. He did not die. By something close to a miracle, the bullet had missed, by the smallest of margins. The great arteries that would have ended him within moments. It damaged his vocal cords, and for a time his voice was reduced to a whisper, and it would never again be quite as strong. But he lived. He was carried back from the front, down through a slow chain of hospitals, recovering by degrees. A tall, thin Englishman with a healing hole through his neck, alive almost beyond reason. And while he lay recovering, something far more dangerous than any sniper was closing in around him. Because the political situation inside the Republic had turned poisonous, and Orwell, through no fault of his own, now found himself on the wrong side of it. This is the heart of the chapter. While Orwell had been freezing in the trenches, doing his part against Franco, the factions on the Republican side had turned against one another. The Soviet-backed communists, growing steadily more powerful within the Republic, moved to crush their rivals on the left, and above all, the very party Orwell had been fighting for, the POUM. There had been street fighting in Barcelona among the supposed allies, and in the aftermath, the communists set out to destroy the POUM completely, and not only to defeat it, but to erase the very meaning of what its men had done. They did not simply ban it, they declared, in print and with great confidence, that it had secretly been a fascist organization all along, a tool of Franco, a nest of traitors and hidden spies. This was false, and Orwell knew with complete certainty that it was false, because he had been there, in the cold trenches, watching these same men bleed and suffer and die, fighting the fascists with their inadequate rifles. But the falsehood was printed anyway. It was repeated steadily, with total assurance. Men he had served beside were arrested, imprisoned, and some of them killed, branded as traitors for a betrayal they had never committed. And here is the thing that changed George Orwell for the rest of his life. The thing we have been walking toward. He had just watched a deliberate lie being manufactured in real time, and watched that lie begin to win. He saw newspapers report battles that had never taken place, and pass over in silence other battles he had lived through. He saw brave men turned into villains by the simple, repeated act of printing it confidently enough and often enough, and he became convinced, permanently and to the depth of his being, that the people in power did not merely want to control the present, they wanted to control the past. They wanted to decide what had happened, and make everyone else believe it, to rewrite the very record of events while the witnesses were still alive and watching it done. Let that settle, because nearly everything he is remembered for grows out of this single experience. The world of his great final novel, the world where those who rule announce that whoever controls the past controls the future, was not dreamed up at a comfortable desk out of nothing. It was witnessed, in fear and disillusionment, in the streets and hospitals and newspapers of Spain. By now he and Eileen, who had come out to Barcelona to be near him, were themselves in genuine danger. The POUM was being hunted through the city, its members rounded up. Orwell, as one of its militiamen, was a wanted man in the very city he had come to love, so they had to hide. They had to slip through a Spain that had turned into a trap, avoiding the secret police, until at last they crossed the border into France, escaping with their lives from the very side they had come to help. He came home to England in the middle of 1937, wounded in the throat, sick at heart, and carrying a story that, to his lasting frustration, almost no one wanted to hear, because much of the European left, devoted to the Soviet Union and to the larger fight against fascism, did not want to believe that the communists in Spain could have behaved so badly toward their own allies. When Orwell tried to tell plainly what he had seen, he found doors closing in front of him. The book he eventually wrote about it, Homage to Catalonia, sold very poorly in his lifetime. The truth he was offering was inconvenient, and the world, for the most part, looked away. But he had it now, the thing he would spend the rest of his short life trying to put into words. He had seen, with his own eyes, and at the risk of his own life, that a lie that is powerful enough, and confident enough, and backed by enough force, can overwhelm the truth and rewrite the past, and that ordinary, decent people can be persuaded to swallow it whole and even defend it. Let that rest now as the chapter closes. A man with a fresh scar across his throat and a deep wound in his faith. home from a war that taught him the most important and most painful lesson of his life. He had gone to Spain a socialist who believed simply and warmly in his cause. He came home a socialist still, but one who now understood, all the way down, that the deepest enemy he would ever face was not any single party, or flag, or man. It was the lie that dresses itself as the truth and dares you to prove otherwise. The war is behind him. The worst of the danger has passed. Let the trenches and the hospitals and the hunted streets of Barcelona fade, and rest. We have all night. Chapter 7. The Machine. The gunfire of Spain falls silent, and what you feel most is how tired he has become. It is the second half of the 1930s. George Orwell is home in England, but he is not well. The wound in his throat has healed, but his lungs, which had troubled him since he was a boy, are slowly growing worse. He had been frail his whole life, prone to bronchitis and fevers and long chest illnesses, and the cold and damp and hardship he kept deliberately choosing to live through were wearing him down. For a time, on the advice of doctors, he and Eileen went to Morocco, to the warmth and dry clean air of Marrakesh, hoping it would ease his breathing. And there, among other work, he wrote a quieter novel called Coming Up for Air, about an ordinary middle-aged man looking back with longing toward a vanished England, and forward with a low, steady dread toward the war he could feel gathering. Because the war was coming. By now, almost everyone could feel it. And in September of 1939, it came. Britain went to war with Nazi Germany, and the world began its long grinding descent into the most destructive conflict in human history. Now, picture his particular frustration, because it is one of the quiet heartbreaks of the life. Here was a man who had already, twice, gone deliberately toward danger in person, in Burma and then in Spain. Here was a man who hated fascism with his whole being, who had been shot through the throat while fighting it in the Spanish hills, and now, with the greatest fight against fascism in all of history finally underway, his own country would not let him take part. He tried to enlist. He was turned down for military service, again and again, because his health was simply too poor and his lungs too badly damaged to be of use. His body had betrayed his will. He did what he could instead. He joined the Home Guard, the volunteer force of older men and unfit men who drilled in the evenings and prepared, as best they could, to defend Britain if the German invasion ever came. He took it seriously, as he took nearly everything, but it was not the front, and he knew it. And then, in 1941, he took a job that stands as one of the great ironies of his life, and also one of its most important chapters. He went to work for the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, helping to produce wartime broadcasts. Sit with the irony a moment. George Orwell, the man whose deepest wound was the discovery in Spain that the powerful manufacture lies and call them truth, the man who would become the world's great enemy of propaganda, went to work inside a propaganda operation. His job, in the Eastern Service of the BBC, was to help produce broadcasts aimed at India and Southeast Asia, part of Britain's enormous wartime effort to shape opinion, keep the empire loyal, and win the long war of words against the enemy. We should be fair and exact about this. the way he would have wanted. The BBC was not a sinister place, and the cause it ultimately served, the defeat of Nazi Germany, was one Orwell believed in completely. He was not betraying himself by working there, but he found the work strange, and often dispiriting, in a particular way that mattered enormously for what came later. He was inside the machine now. He could see, from within, exactly how messages were built and shaped and aimed at an audience. He saw the bureaucracy of it, the committees, the cautious internal censorship, the careful daily management of what could and could not be said over the air. He saw how even a broadcaster fighting on the right side of a genuinely just war still had to bend its words, still had to leave certain things out, still had to perform a version of the truth rather than tell it whole. And being who he was, he watched all of it closely, and he remembered, years later, this experience fed directly into his masterpiece. The vast government department in his final novel, the one whose entire purpose is the management and falsification of information, did not appear out of nowhere. It came, in part, from a thin, observant man sitting in the offices and studios of wartime broadcasting, watching how a modern state actually talks to its people, and how easily the shaping of a message shades into the shaping of the truth itself. Even one small detail seems to have stayed with him and travelled into the book. There was, by various accounts, a particular room at the BBC used for certain meetings, and its number is widely said to have become the name of the most frightening place in all his fiction. The room where a person is finally broken by being made to face the one thing they cannot bear. Room 101. We cannot prove the story beyond doubt, so we hold it lightly, but it has the ring of him about it, the dull and the everyday turning into the stuff of nightmare. An ordinary conference room in wartime London, remade by the mind of a watching writer into a symbol the whole world would one day recognise. These were hard years in other ways too. Eileen was working through the war as well, in a government department of her own, sharing the strain, the rationing, the long, anxious nights of the bombing of London. They had very little money. His health kept declining, and through all of it he was writing, constantly, essays and reviews and columns, pouring out some of the finest short prose of the century, even as the larger work waited inside him. He had, by now, an unmistakable voice, plain, exact, fearless, allergic to cant and to comfortable lies, equally willing to attack the enemy abroad and the foolishness and dishonesty he saw close to home. In 1943, after roughly 2 years, he resigned from the BBC. He had come to feel that the work was not truly worthwhile, that he was, by his own harsh reckoning, pouring his limited energy into something close to wasted effort. He wanted his words to do more than serve a wartime committee. He wanted to write something that would last, something true and clear enough to outlive the moment. He moved on to become the literary editor of a left-wing weekly paper called Tribune, where he could write more freely, in his own voice, about the things he actually cared about, and there, in that freer air, with the war still raging, but a great idea now fully formed and pressing inside him, he began at last to write the book that would make his name. It would be short. It would be strange. On its surface, it would be nothing more than a simple story about animals on a farm, and underneath It would be the most devastating attack on betrayed revolution and political lying that anyone had yet dared to write in plain English. Let that rest as the chapter closes. A sick, tired, brilliant man, having served his time inside the great machine of wartime words, stepping back out, picking up his pen, and beginning to write a small fable that would outlive every powerful person who had ever doubted him. The great work is only just beginning. Rest now, and let it begin tomorrow. Chapter 8. Animal Farm. Stay close to him, because the great turning of his life is about to arrive, and it comes wrapped in a story so simple a child could follow every word. It is the heart of the war. Around 1943 and on into 1944, George Orwell, freed from the BBC and writing for Tribune, carrying everything Spain had burned into him, sits down to attempt something he has been turning over for a long time. He wants to show ordinary readers, as plainly and unforgettably as he can, how a revolution made in the name of equality can be twisted, step by step, into a new tyranny every bit as cruel as the old one it replaced. He wants to show how the great hope of the Russian Revolution had curdled, Stalin, into terror and lies and the worship of a single man. But he does not want a long, dry political argument that only a few hundred committed readers would finish. He wants something clear enough and human enough that a working man could understand the whole of it on a single bus ride home. So he reaches for one of the oldest and simplest forms there is, the fable, the animal story. The idea, he later said, came in part from a scene he had actually witnessed. He had seen a young boy driving a huge cart horse along a narrow path, whipping it whenever it tried to turn, and it struck him with sudden force that if only such powerful animals understood their own strength, we would have no way to hold power over them, and that men exploit the labouring animals much as the rich exploit the poor, by keeping them from ever seeing how strong they truly are. From that one small act of everyday cruelty grew one of the most famous books of the century. Let the story settle, because you may already half know its shape. On a farm, the animals, worked to exhaustion and slaughtered the moment they are no longer useful, finally rise up and drive out the cruel human farmer. Now they will run the farm themselves. As equals, all animals, they declare, are equal. They are full of hope. They have made their revolution, and the future belongs to them. But slowly, so slowly, the other animals can barely perceive it. The pigs, the cleverest among them, take charge. Step by step, the pigs become the new masters. They take the best of the food. They change the rules a little at a time, always with a clever reason ready. They rewrite the very history of the revolution to suit themselves, until the animals can no longer be sure what was promised at the start, and they keep the others confused and obedient through a steady flood of fear and propaganda and confident lies. By the end, the pigs are walking upright on two legs, wearing clothes, dining with the humans and the other animals, looking desperately from pig to man and from man to pig, find they can no longer tell the two apart. The revolution against the masters has produced only a new set of masters. That is the shape of it, and inside that simple farmyard tale, anyone with open eyes could read the story of how a revolution made for the people had been betrayed and turned into a dictatorship over them. It was funny, and heartbreaking, and merciless, and, as far as he could make it, true. And here is where the story of the book becomes almost as revealing as the book itself. So follow this carefully, because it shows you exactly the wall Orwell was up against. He finished it, and then, for a long and frustrating time, he could not get it published at all. Think about why. He had written it during the war, and all through that war, the Soviet Union, Stalin's Soviet Union, was Britain's crucial ally. Soviet soldiers were dying by the millions against the Nazis on the Eastern Front. The British government, and a great deal of British opinion with it, did not want anything published that might insult or embarrass this vital ally in the middle of the fight. A sharp, savage satire portraying Stalin as a greedy, murderous pig was, to put it gently, not welcome. So one publisher after another turned the little book away. Some were openly nervous about offending the Soviets. In one case, famous since, a publisher set the manuscript aside, partly on the advice of an official who, it emerged only years later, had been working for Soviet intelligence all along. In another, a publisher who had at first accepted the book grew cold and uneasy and backed away, and so Orwell was left to watch his own small fable. A fable precisely about the suppression of inconvenient truth, be itself suppressed, by powerful and respectable people who found its truth inconvenient. The irony was almost too much to bear, and he felt it keenly. He even wrote a fierce essay, intended as a preface, about this very thing, about how censorship in a supposedly free country is very often not imposed by law at all, but happens through simple cowardice, and through the general unspoken agreement among respectable people not to say the things the powerful would prefer left unsaid. The most dangerous censorship, he argued, is the kind that needs no censor, because everyone has already agreed in advance what must not be said. Now lay against this long publishing struggle the private grief unfolding at the same time, because in this stretch of the life the two are bound tightly together. Orwell and Eileen, who had no children of their own, had decided in this period to adopt a baby boy. They named him Richard, and Orwell, this thin, austere, famously serious man, turned out to be a tender and devoted father, delighting in the child with a warmth that surprised some of the people who had only known his stern public voice. For one brief moment, in the middle of the war and the struggle and the steady illness, there was a small fragile family happiness in his life. And then, in the spring of 1945, with the war in Europe almost won, came the blow that broke that happiness apart. Aileen, his wife, his partner through Spain and poverty and the long hard years, went into the hospital for an operation. It was expected to be relatively routine. She did not survive it. She died under the anaesthetic. Suddenly, at the age of only 39, let that loss sit a moment, the way it must have sat in him. He was away when it happened, working as a war correspondent in Europe. He came home to a motherless baby and an empty, silent house. The woman who had shared the very hardest years of his life, who had come out to Spain and nearly died beside him there, was simply, suddenly gone. He spoke and wrote very little about his deepest feelings. as was always his way, but those close to him understood that the wound went very deep. He carried on, because he had to, because there was a small son who needed him, and because there was, at long last, a great book about to appear. For at last, in August of 1945, after all the rejections and delay, Animal Farm was published. The war was ending. The political winds were shifting. And now, suddenly, the world was ready to hear what it had to say. And the world heard it. The little fable no one had dared to print became, almost at once, an immediate and enormous success. It made him, after all those years of poverty and obscurity, genuinely famous, and for the first time in his life, financially secure. The clarity of it, the daring of it, the perfect and simple cruelty of its truth, struck readers everywhere it went. It has never once been out of print since. Let the strange double weight of this rest as the chapter closes. In the space of a single year, George Orwell lost the wife who had walked beside him through everything, and gained the fame and security he had struggled toward his whole life. The triumph and the grief arrived almost together, so close he could scarcely feel the one for the weight of the other. He was a famous man now, and a widower, and a father, with badly damaged lungs, and, for the first time, real money coming in, and one last great book still waiting inside him. Let him rest tonight, with his small son sleeping somewhere nearby in the quiet house. Chapter 9. Jura. Let the noise and bustle of sudden fame fall away, and travel with him to the very edge of the map, to a place of wind and water and deep settling silence. It is 1946. Animal Farm has made George Orwell famous and, for the first time, comfortable. London wants him. Editors want his words. Invitations and parties and the whole busy machinery of literary success have opened up in front of him, and he turns away from nearly all of it and goes, deliberately, to one of the most remote inhabited places in the British Isles. He goes to the Isle of Jura, in the Hebrides, off the wild western coast of Scotland. Picture the place, because the place is part of the story. Jura is a long wild island of bare hills and open bog and rough grazing land, with only a small scattering of people across the whole of it. The house he took, called Barnhill, sat near the northern end, far from the village, far from any road worth the name. At the end of a long, rough, jolting track, there was no electricity, there was no telephone. To reach it at all, you travelled by boat, then by that rough track, to the far end of a thinly peopled island, at the very edge of the open Atlantic. Ask why a newly famous, newly comfortable, gravely ill man would choose such a place, and you touch something essential about him. Part of the reason was simple. He wanted quiet, and distance, and the chance to write his great last book without the constant noise of London pulling at his sleeve. Part of it was the old instinct that had carried him to the tramps and the kitchens and the coal mines, the need to live a real, physical, hands-on life, to grow his own vegetables, to fish, to do honest practical work with his own body. And part of it, perhaps, was something harder to name. The pull of a stark elemental place on a man who half sensed his time was running short. and who wanted to spend what was left of it on his own fierce terms. For he was dying now, though he would not say the word, even to himself. The tuberculosis that had been gathering for years in his damaged lungs was steadily advancing. He coughed. He tired easily. He ran fevers in the night. And yet on Jura he drove himself hard, working the land, hauling and lifting, planting, looking after his little son Richard, living a life of deliberate physical effort that a healthy man would have found demanding, and that for a dying man was close to reckless. Feel the strange mix of beauty and sadness in it. The most clear-eyed writer of his age, the man who saw through every comfortable illusion other people lived by, would not quite turn and look squarely at the plain truth of his own failing body. He kept working as though there were all the time in the world. He kept living as though the clean island air and the hard, honest labour might hold the illness back a little longer. And it was here, in this remote farmhouse, often cold, often unwell, sometimes propped up in bed with a fever and the typewriter balanced before him, that he wrote his masterpiece. Day after day, through the long pale light of the northern summer and the dark and storms of winter, he set down, line by line, the bleak and brilliant pages of the novel that would seal his name forever. We will come to that book fully in the next chapter, for it deserves its own hour. For now, hold the image of how it was made, not in comfort, and not in health, but by a dying man at the edge of the world, racing his own failing lungs to finish it in time. Into this remote life there came, at one point, a moment of real danger that has since become one of the famous stories of his last years, and it tells you almost everything about the man. But we will walk through it without alarm, because it ends safely, and there is no need for your own heart to race tonight. Off the northern tip of Jura lies one of the most powerful tidal whirlpools in the world, a churning, roaring stretch of sea called the Corryvreckan, where the great tides race between the islands and the water turns violent and deadly. One day, in the summer of 1947, Orwell took a small boat out, with his young son and 2 other young members of his family aboard, and they misjudged the fierce shifting tides. They were drawn in near the great whirlpool. The little outboard motor was torn clean off the back of the boat by the sheer force of the water, and for a few moments they were in serious and immediate danger of being drowned. There, in one of the deadliest pieces of sea around all of Britain, breathe slowly, because every one of them lived. They managed, by hard rowing, to reach a small, bare, rocky island, where the boat overturned as they came in, tipping them all into the cold sea. The little boy among them, they scrambled up onto the bare, wet rock, soaked and stranded, with no way to call for help, and there they waited, until by simple good fortune a passing fishing boat caught sight of them and took them off. Sit with that picture, George Orwell, a dying man, on a bare rock at the edge of the Atlantic, having just nearly drowned himself and his own beloved son through a simple misreading of the tides, waiting on the wet stone for a rescue he could not be sure was coming. He had survived a sniper's bullet through the throat in Spain. Now he had survived a whirlpool off the coast of Scotland. The same restless, stubborn courage that had made him great kept leading him, again and again, right to the edge of death, and again something pulled him back. But only for a while. The cost of all of it, The cold, the heavy labour, the damp house, the relentless driving of his sick body to finish the book, was terrible, and it came due. Through these Jura years his health collapsed further. He suffered serious bouts of illness, spent long stretches in a sanatorium, grew steadily thinner and weaker. He surely knew, somewhere underneath, what was happening to him, and still he went back to the island, and still he worked, because the book had to be finished, and there was almost no time left to finish it. He pushed on through draft after draft, typing the final version himself, sick and exhausted, when by every right he should have been resting completely. Those close to him came to feel, afterward, that the sheer effort of finishing the book, in those conditions and in that place, had very likely shortened what little life he had left. He seems, in some real sense, to have traded the last of his bodily strength for the completion of his final warning to the world. Chapter 10, 1984. Stay in the lamplight of that island room, and let us look, at last, at the book itself. It was published in June of 1949, and it carried a title made of nothing more than a single year, 1984. The explanation most often repeated is that Orwell took the year he was finishing the book, 1948, and reversed its final two figures, turning the present into a future close enough to touch. He never fully confirmed this, and other explanations have been offered, so we hold it lightly. But whatever its source, the effect of that title was deliberate and brilliant. He was not writing about some far distant age no living reader would ever see. He was writing about the day after tomorrow. Let the world of the book settle around you the way it settles around its reader. It is a grey, cold, broken down city, in a state called Oceania, one of three great powers locked together in a war that never seems to end and may not even be real. The state is ruled by a single party, and at the top of that party, watching out from every poster and every screen, is a face that may or may not belong to any living man. The people call him Big Brother, and beneath that ever-watching face, one ordinary human being tries, for a little while, to think his own private thoughts. His name is Winston Smith, and his job, of all the jobs in that grey world, is precisely the one Orwell had been preparing to describe ever since the streets of Barcelona. Winston works in the Ministry of Truth, and his daily task is to change the past. Whenever the party's predictions turn out wrong, whenever yesterday's hero is suddenly declared today's traitor, it is Winston who rewrites the old newspapers and records, so the past always matches whatever the party needs it to be today. The inconvenient old truth is dropped into a slot, into what the book calls the memory hole, and burned. And after that, it never happened at all. Notice what that is. It is exactly what Orwell had watched the propagandists begin to do in Spain, only made total, made permanent, made the entire organizing principle of a whole society. He had seen, with his own eyes, living men erased from the record while they still walked the earth, and he built an entire imagined civilization on that single trick. And around that core he placed the ideas the world has never been able to forget, the words that climbed up out of his book and into every living language. There is Big Brother, the ever-watching face of the all-seeing state. the source of the phrase we still reach for whenever we feel ourselves observed. There is the telescreen, the device in every room that shows you the party's message and watches you at the very same moment. So you can never be certain you are not seen. And so, in the end, you learn to police your own self. There is newspeak, the official language the party is building, designed not to add words, but to remove them, to shrink and shrink the range of what can be said, until certain dangerous thoughts can no longer even be formed, because the words for them have ceased to exist. To control a people's language, Orwell saw, is to begin controlling their thoughts. There is doublethink, the trained ability to hold two flatly contradictory beliefs at once and accept both, to know a thing is false and believe it true at the same time, because the party requires it, and there are the party's slogans, the short, brutal phrases that bind opposites together, calling war by the name of peace, freedom by the name of slavery, ignorance by the name of strength, marrying each word to its opposite until plain meaning dissolves. And underneath all of it lies the idea Spain had burned into him years before, set down now in its purest form. Whoever controls the past controls the future, and whoever controls the present controls the past. Change the records, and you have changed what is real. This, as he had come to see it across all the years since Barcelona, was the deepest danger of his age, and the warning at the centre of his life's work. Winston tries, for a while, to resist. He keeps a secret diary, which is itself a crime. He falls in love, which is itself a crime too, because the party permits no loyalty that might compete with loyalty to itself. For a time he believes he has found a small hidden place, a pocket of private human freedom, and then the state closes its hand. He is caught and broken, methodically, by a man who is almost gentle about it, in the place whose name Orwell may well have carried out of that ordinary London office building. Room 101, the room that holds, for each person, the one thing in all the world they cannot bear to face. And in the end, Winston is not merely defeated, not merely silenced. He is remade from the inside. He is taught not simply to obey Big Brother, but to love him. The victory of the state is total, because it has reached all the way down into the most private chamber of a single human mind, and rewritten what it found there. Now here is the thing we must say clearly, because it is the most misunderstood part of the whole book, and getting it right is itself a small act of the honesty he cared about. 1984 is not a prophecy. Orwell was not predicting the world would literally look like this in some coming year. He said as much himself. Plainly, he was not a fortune teller pointing at a calendar and naming a date. He was holding up a mirror and a warning. He took the things he had already seen with his own eyes, the manufactured lies of Spain, the machinery of wartime information, the worship of Stalin, the confident falsehoods told in broad daylight, and followed them out to their logical and terrible end, so people might learn to recognize the early signs and refuse them while there was still time. The book is not a forecast of what must happen. It is a description of what could happen, written so unforgettably that we might make sure it never does. And that is the deepest reason it has never once loosened its grip. Every generation since has looked out at its own world, at its own propaganda and surveillance and confident official lies, and felt that same cold shock of recognition, not because Orwell guessed the right date, for the year itself came and went long ago, but because he understood something permanent about power and truth and the fragility of the simple freedom to think for yourself. He finished it, as we have seen, in a cold farmhouse at the edge of the Atlantic, racing his ruined lungs to the line, typing that final draft himself when he had no business doing anything but resting. He spent strength on it he did not have to spare, and when it was done and published, it was recognized almost at once for exactly what it was, one of the most important books of the century, a warning that would outlast, by many generations, the dying man who carried it. Let that rest as the chapter closes. The book was finished. The warning was set down, whole and clear, and sent out into the world, and the frail man who had given the last of his strength to deliver it had almost none of that strength left. The work is done. There is nothing more tonight that needs doing. Rest. Chapter 11. The Last Winter. Let the great book go out into the world on its own, and turn back to the frail man who made it, because his own time is very nearly over. By the time 1984 appeared, in June of 1949, George Orwell was seriously, and by now visibly, dying. The tuberculosis had won its long, slow campaign. The years of cold and hardship and quiet self-neglect, the trenches of Spain, the damp of Jura, the relentless driving of an already weak body, had finally caught up with him. He had spent time in a sanatorium in the English countryside, and then he was moved to a hospital in London, University College Hospital, and there, in a quiet hospital room, the last act of his life played itself out. Picture the strange, painful shape of this final year. At the very moment he became one of the most famous living writers in the world, with 2 books behind him that had changed how people thought, and with money and acclaim at last pouring toward him. He was far too ill to enjoy any of it. The success arrived almost exactly as the body gave out beneath him. He lay in his hospital bed, receiving the steady news of his own triumph, and could not so much as rise to go and meet it. And yet even now he went on making plans to live. This is one of the quietly moving things about the way he ended. He did not simply lie down and surrender. He spoke of future books he meant to write, of essays still half formed in his mind, of work he still intended to do. He arranged to travel to a clinic high in the mountains of Switzerland, hoping the clean cold air and the treatment might buy him a little more time. He behaved right to the last, like a man who fully intended to go on living. And in this final stretch, 2 things happened that belong in any honest telling of this life, and we will give both their due, the tender and the troubling alike, because he himself never wished to be flattered into something simpler than the complicated man he was. The first is that he married again, in October of 1949, in his hospital room, too weak now even to leave his bed. George Orwell married a woman named Sonia Brownell. She was a good deal younger than he was, connected to the London literary world, and the marriage has been read in many ways by those who came after. Some have seen it as a strange, sad arrangement at the end of a dying man's life, but it is also possible to see it more generously. as the act of a lonely and seriously ill man reaching out for companionship, and for some order and security for his small son's future, wanting someone steady to stand beside him and care for the work and the child he knew he would soon leave behind. They were married at his bedside. He had, by various accounts, even arranged for a fine velvet jacket to wear for the small ceremony. Propped up against the pillows, there is something both heartbreaking and very human in that image. A dying man, dressing as well as he still could, to be married in the very room where he was fading. The second thing is harder, and we include it precisely because we have promised, all along, not to turn this man into a simple saint. In that same period, around 1949, Orwell did something that has caused real and lasting argument about his memory ever since. He gave to a friend named Celia Kirwan, who had recently begun working for a small unit of the British government called the Information Research Department, a list of names. The names were of writers, journalists, and public figures whom he believed to be secret communists or sympathizers with the Soviet Union, people he judged unsuitable to be employed for the kind of anti-communist work the department was doing. The existence of this list became publicly known only many years later, when the official files were released, and it shocked many of his admirers. Let us be fair and exact about this, because it is exactly the kind of fact where honesty matters most. This was not a police list, and no one was arrested because of it. Its purpose, as best the surviving record shows, was to advise a government body on whom it ought not to hire for its own propaganda. And it came from a man who had fought Stalinism with his whole life, and who genuinely believed Soviet communism to be a mortal threat to human freedom. To his defenders, the list was consistent with everything he had always stood for, a clear-eyed refusal to let secret admirers of a tyranny quietly shape the public conversation. To his critics, it sits very uneasily beside the work of the man who wrote so powerfully against surveillance and denunciation, and the hunger of the state to label its people and keep files on their private beliefs. Both views are held, seriously and in good faith, by thoughtful people, and the fairest thing we can do tonight is set the fact down plainly, and let you weigh it for yourself. Let that complexity sit, without needing to resolve it. He was not a saint. He never claimed to be. He was a man who hated tyranny so fiercely that even at the very end of his life, dying in a hospital bed, he was still trying to find some way to act against it, in a manner some have found admirable and others genuinely painful, and that was, perhaps, in the end, both at once. The plans for Switzerland went forward. The journey up to the mountains was arranged. He was to leave in the last days of January. He never went. On the night of the 21st of January, 1950, alone in his hospital room in London, a blood vessel burst in his ruined lungs. The bleeding took him quickly. He was 46 years old. Let that stillness fill the room a moment, the way it filled his. The boy born at the far edge of the empire in India, the lonely scholarship boy, the colonial policeman, the tramp, the dishwasher, the soldier shot clean through the throat, the husband twice over, the devoted father, the man who had given the last of his body to finish his final warning to the world, was gone, in the dark, in a quiet hospital room, with his great fame still only a few months old. He had asked, in his will, to be buried simply in the English countryside, according to the old rites of the Church of England, which is itself a small surprising detail about this complicated unbeliever. And so he was, in a quiet country churchyard, in the village of Sutton Courtenay. There is a plain, modest headstone. It does not say George Orwell anywhere upon it. It carries, by his own clear wish, only his real name, the name he was born with, Eric Arthur Blair, born in 1903, died in 1950. Nothing more, no mention of the famous books, no mention of the borrowed name the whole world had come to know. Let that rest as the chapter closes. The man returned, in the end, to the plain, true name he started with, and lay down beneath it in English ground, while the other name, George Orwell, the name he had once chosen almost shyly from a river he loved, rose up and went on without him, and grew only larger with every passing year. He is at rest now. There is a little of the night still left to us. Chapter 12. The word he left behind. Sit with what remains. Now that the man himself is gone, George Orwell died young, at 46, with only 2 truly famous books to his name, and a life that had so often been poor and painful and unknown to the public. By the cold measure of years and comfort, it was a short life, and in many plain ways a hard and unlucky one. And yet almost no other writer of the last 100 years has left so deep a mark on the way we see our own world. To understand why, we have to look at the strange afterlife of his work, and above all at the single word that grew, in time, out of his chosen name. That word, of course, is Orwellian. You have heard it spoken many times. People reach for it to describe surveillance, propaganda, the manipulation of language, the official lie delivered with a straight face, the low, uneasy sense of a watching power that wants to get inside your head. It has become one of the most useful and one of the most carelessly overused words in the language. And here lies an irony he would have appreciated. Even as it exasperated him, the word built from his name is very often misused. People reach for Orwellian to describe almost anything they happen to dislike about authority. Any rule, any inconvenience, any official they distrust, until the word means little more than "this annoys me," and it feels official. And that lazy, purely emotional use of a word to score a quick point, while draining it of real meaning, is nearly the precise opposite of what the real George Orwell spent his life fighting for. He had given himself, above all, to making language sharper, clearer, more honest. The careless use of his own name to make language foggier would have pained him. So set the famous word aside a moment, and ask the better question. What did the real man actually stand for? Underneath the borrowed nightmares of marching pigs and watching screens, he stood, before nearly anything else, for plain and honest language, because he believed the two were bound together. You cannot for long keep clear thoughts inside foggy words. Vague, ugly writing, he argued in one of his most enduring essays, is never merely bad style. It is dangerous, because muddy language is the great tool for defending what cannot honestly be defended, for making cruelty sound respectable and lies sound reasonable. Clear writing is a form of moral courage. Force yourself to say plainly what you mean, and you can no longer hide a rotten idea inside a beautiful fog. To write clearly is to think clearly, and to think clearly is the first defence against being deceived. Out of that same root grew the thing he defended most fiercely, the simple, stubborn reality of objective truth itself. What frightened him more than any single dictator, the thing he had watched being born in Spain, was not any one tyrant or party. It was the colder idea that there is no such thing as real, knowable truth at all, that the powerful might simply decide, day to day, what had happened, and make everyone believe it. He held, to the end, that facts are real things, that 2 and 2 make 4 whatever power insists, that some things happened and others did not, and the freedom to say so out loud is the root from which every other freedom grows. When that freedom goes, he warned, everything goes down with it, and holding it all together was the quality perhaps rarest of all, a stubborn, awkward, unbuyable honesty that bent to no side. He criticised the political right because, as he saw it, the right defended injustice openly. He criticised his own left, just as openly and often more painfully, because the left excused that same injustice the moment their own side committed it. He flattered no party, not even the one he belonged to and would have died for. He defended the poor without sentimentalizing them. He hated tyranny without pretending his own side was innocent of it. Before he was loyal to any tribe or flag, he was loyal to the truth as best he could find it, and that, in any age, is the rarest and hardest loyalty there is. And feel, a little, why this still matters to you tonight. So many years after that cold January morning in the hospital room, it matters because the things he warned about did not stay behind in his books. We live now in a world of glowing screens that watch us as we watch them, awash in more information than anyone can hold, and less of it we feel we can trust. A world of confident public falsehoods and rushing floods of words that seem built to confuse rather than to clarify. The exact machinery he imagined is not quite the machinery we built, but the deeper danger he pointed toward, the slow erosion of plain truth and clear language, and the simple right to think for oneself, is every bit as alive in our day as in his, and it was he who handed us the words to name it: Big Brother, Newspeak, Doublethink, the memory whole. He gave us a vocabulary for the thing, so we might recognize it as it comes, and find the breath to say no. And so the final shape of his life turns out not to be a shape of failure, or of mere early death. It is the shape of a warning delivered, against great odds, and delivered well, a frail, sick, often unlucky man, who could so easily have lived softly and comfortably, and chose, again and again, not to, who went out and saw the worst of the world for himself, and then spent the last of his strength turning what he saw into words clear enough, and true enough, to outlast him by generations. He left us no neat answer. He was too honest for easy answers, and he distrusted the people who offered them. What he left instead was harder to carry. He left us awake. He left us the stubborn habit of looking twice at the confident voice, of testing the official word against what we can see for ourselves, of guarding the plain meaning of plain words as though our freedom depended on it. because he had come, through a lifetime of looking, to believe that it does. That is the inheritance, not the gloom of the nightmare, but the steady call to stay clear-eyed inside it, to love the truth enough to keep saying it plainly, and to refuse, stubbornly and for as long as we live, to let anyone persuade us that the thing we saw with our own eyes did not happen. Let all of that grow quiet now, and settle into the dark, the whole long, honest life, and the warning it became, and the plain, true name beneath the famous one. You do not need to hold any of it tonight. You can let the empire, and the island, and the quiet hospital room drift away towards sleep, the watchful boy beside the river, the young man with the new scar across his throat, the tired writer at the typewriter racing his own breath. You can let them all rest now, as he himself rests, beneath his own plain name, in the quiet English ground. The truth he loved will still be here in the morning. It always is, for those willing to look at it plainly. So, close your eyes. You are safe, and the night is kind, and there is nothing left that you need to do. Sleep well. We had all night, and the night was enough.